Look at the world today. If you turn on the news, scroll through your phone, or walk through the line at any airport on earth, you are moving through a world shaped by one incredibly specific idea. It is an idea that has collapsed empires, started world wars, bankrupted superpowers, and rewritten the laws of modern society. And yet, for most of human history, we didn't even have a word for it. We treat terrorism like it's a modern disease, a byproduct of the 21st century. We think of men in ski masks, hijacked planes, and shadowy forums on the internet. But long ago, the internet, long before gunpowder or the French Revolution, or the word terror was even spoken, human beings made a terrifying discovery. You don't need to defeat an enemy's army to win a war, you just need to hijack their imagination. This is not a video about a single attack, or a single group, or a single religion. This is the story of how fear became a technology, how it was invented in the ancient world, refined by modern governments, weaponized by solitary individuals, and eventually hardwired into the algorithms that govern our daily lives. Over the next hour, we are going to trace the invisible thread that connects a dagger in an ancient marketplace 2000 years ago directly to the screen you are looking at right now. Because to understand why the world looks the way it does today, you have to understand the history of the people who tried to break it. Fear is older than language. Before governments, before law, before anyone had a word for it, human beings already understood one truth that has never been changed. You don't need an army to control people. You just need to make them afraid of what comes next. That idea didn't start with bombs, or manifestos, or breaking news alerts. It started thousands of years ago, in crowded marketplaces, mountain fortresses, and burning cities, carried out by people who had no name for what they were doing. But they knew exactly what they were doing. Jerusalem, mid 1st century. A religious festival. Thousands of bodies pressed together in the heat. Somewhere in that crowd, a man adjusts his cloak, and underneath it, a small curved blade. The Romans called it a sica, and the man who carried them was called the Sicarii, the dagger man. They weren't soldiers. They wore no uniforms. They moved through the crowds, stuck their heads in the broad daylight, then vanished. Not by running, but by blending in, joining the panic, shouting in outrage alongside everyone else. Their most famous target was Jonathan the high priest, killed inside the second temple itself, not in secret, in public, because the killing was never really the point. The point was the question it planted in every powerful person who heard about it. Is today the day? The psychological corrosion, that constant creeping uncertainty, is what terrorism is actually designed to produce. Not the act, the dread of the act. The Sicarii understood this over 2000 years ago, long before anyone had a word for it. Fast forward 1,000 years, the Crusades, empires colliding across the Middle East. And in the mountains of Persia, in a fortress called Elamat, a man is building something that will make kings sleep with their doors locked for 2 centuries. The Order of Assassins. They were a minority religious community surrounded by enemies on every side, empires that could have crushed them militarily without a second thought. So they didn't fight militarily, they made fighting them not worth it. Their operatives embedded in cities for months. They studied their targets, they waited. And when that moment came, it was surgical. A blade up close, in public, visible. not because they couldn't be more discreet, because the method was the message. We can reach anyone, anywhere, anytime. Over 2 centuries, they reshaped the political landscape of the medieval Middle East, not through armies, but through the fear of what they might do next. Alliances shifted, decisions were reversed, wars were avoided, all because of a threat that lived more in the imagination than on any battlefield. The word assassin, still in use today, came directly from them. That alone tells you how deeply they marked history. But what happens when the most powerful military force on earth also decides to weaponize fear? The Mongols. Their strategy was almost elegant. When their armies approached a city, they sent an offer first: submit, pay tribute, and we leave you in peace. And they meant it. Cities that surrendered were often left intact. But cities that refused, those weren't just defeated, they were erased, visibly, completely, in ways they would be talked about for generations. Because that was the point. The story of what happened to the last city that said no. That story marched ahead of the actual army. It arrived weeks before the cavalry. It broke resistance before a single arrow was fired. One historian observed that Mongol terror tactics worked precisely because they immobilized and incapacitated the forces that would have resisted. Fear didn't just support the military strategy, fear was the military strategy. And yet, before all of them, there was an empire that perhaps systematized this more deliberately than anyone: the Assyrians. They ruled across what is now Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, and they held it together not through loyalty or culture, but through documented, methodical, advertised fear. Their kings left stone carvings in conquered territories not to celebrate victory, but to show neighboring states exactly what defeat looked like. The walls of their palace chambers, where foreign leaders came to negotiate, were decorated with scenes of conquest and mass displacement. Before a vassal king can even open his mouth, the walls were already talking. They destroyed crops during harvest season, not just to feed their armies, but to starve any future resistance. They displaced entire populations across thousands of miles to shatter communities and erase identities. And perhaps most chillingly, they took the gods of conquered people, deported their religious statues, absorbed their deities into the Assyrian order. The message wasn't just, "We defeated you." It was, "Even your gods have left you." One Assyrian king summarized these campaigns in 3 words: I razed, I destroyed, I burned. Before me, cities. Behind me, ruins. Not collateral damage, architecture. 4 groups, thousands of years apart, completely different cultures, religions, and contexts, and the same core understanding. Arrived at independently every single time. Fear is a force, and if you learn to direct it, it is more powerful than any army. None of them use the word terrorism, but every single one of them had already mastered the concept, which raises a question worth sitting with. If this instinct is this old, this consistent across this many centuries and cultures, what does that tell us about what comes next? Everything we have covered so far has one thing in common. The people who practiced it had no word for what we were doing. The Sicarii didn't call themselves terrorists. Neither did the Mongols. Neither did the Assyrian kings who carved their victories into stones. They just did it. That changes right here, right now, in the late 18th century. Because for the first time in history, a government didn't just use terror, it named it, defended it, wrote it into political philosophy. And the word they used? La terror, the terror. France, 1789. A revolution is tearing the country apart. The monarchy has fallen. The king has been executed. A new republic, built on the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, is trying to hold itself together while being attacked from every direction. Royalists within, European monarchies threatening from outside, regional revolts breaking out across the country. Into this chaos steps a lawyer from northern France, soft spoken, meticulous, a man who had once publicly opposed the death penalty. His name was Maximilien Robespierre, and he was about to oversee the execution of tens of thousands of people. Robespierre rose through the revolutionary government on the strength of his oratory and his absolute, uncompromising idealism. He believed, genuinely believed, that he was building a perfect society, that the revolution was a sacred mission, that anyone who stood in its way was not simply a political opponent. They were an enemy of virtue itself. And enemies of virtue, in his view, deserved no mercy. By 1793, Robespierre sat at the head of the Committee of Public Safety, the governing body that, despite its reassuring name, functioned as the near dictatorial emergency government. And what followed became one of the most chilling episodes in modern political history. Not because of its scale alone, but because of how it was justified. Robespierre didn't apologize for the terror, he theorized it. In a speech to the National Convention, he argued that terror was not the enemy of virtue, it was the expression of it. That a republic under threat had not only the right but the obligation to use fear as a governing instrument. He called it the emanation of virtue. Think about that for a moment. A government official standing before a legislature arguing that systematically executing your own citizens, not enemies on a battlefield, but neighbors, priests, aristocrats, and eventually fellow revolutionaries, was a moral act. That is the moment the concept of state terror was born. Between 1793 and 1794, over 16,000 people were officially sentenced to death across France. An estimated 10 to 20,000 more executed without trial or died in prison awaiting one. The guillotine became the symbol of the age, not because it was the most violent method of execution in history, but because of what it represented. Public, systematic, state-organized death, carried out not in the heat of the battle, but in town squares, before crowds, on schedules, conducted in the name of the people, for their protection. And here is the detail that stops you cold. Robespierre himself had once argued that the death penalty was barbaric, that a civilized society should abolish it entirely. He signed death warrants by the thousands. The terror eventually consumed itself, as these things often do. The revolutionary government began executing its own members. No one was safe, not the moderate, not the radical, not even Robespierre's closest allies. The logic of the terror, once set in motion, had no natural stopping point, because the definition of enemy of the revolution could always be expanded, always stretched just a little further. In July 1974, members of the government, fearing they were next, turned on Robespierre. He was arrested, tried within hours, and guillotined the following day. The man who had weaponized state terror was killed by it. What the French Revolution introduced to the world was something genuinely new. Not just the practice of terror, ancient empires had done that, but the legitimization of terror by a democratic government. The idea that a state founded on the rights of the people could turn those same instruments of power against the people and frame it as protection. This template didn't die with Robespierre. It traveled, it evolved, it was studied, replicated, and refined by governments across the next 2 centuries, some of whom called it by its name, and some of whom found cleaner words for it. State sponsored terror, government purges, ideological cleansing, managed fear. Different eras, different flags, same logic. The ancient world gave us the practice of terror. The French Revolution gave us the word. And once something had a name, once it can be written into policy, defended in speeches, taught in political philosophy, it became something far more dangerous than a blade in a marketplace or an army on a horizon. It became a system. And systems, unlike empires, don't always fall. There is a question that sits in the heart of this story. We have seen empires use fear as a governing tool. We have seen a revolutionary government name it, theorize it, turn it into policy. But all of that still feels distant, historical, something that happened to other people in other centuries. So, when did terrorism start feeling like the world we actually live in? The answer begins in the late 1800s, and it begins not with an army, not with the government, but with a single idea, passed between desperate people in crowded European cities. The idea was simple: one act of violence, aimed at the right person, at the right moment, can change everything. They called it propaganda of the deed. To understand why this idea exploded when it did, you have to understand the world it was born into. The late 19th century was a time of staggering inequality. Industrialization had made a small number of people extraordinarily wealthy and had driven millions of others into factories, into poverty, into conditions that modern observers would find difficult to imagine. 14-hour workdays, child labor, no rights, no recourse, governments that answered to the wealthy and suppressed everyone else with police and military force. Into this environment came a political philosophy called anarchism, the belief that all hierarchical power, including the state itself, was inherently corrupt and needed to be dismantled. Most anarchists were not violent. Most advocated for organized, for strikes, for building new social structures from the ground up. But a faction within the movement drew a different conclusion. If the state used violence to maintain its power, and it did, openly and without apology, then violence in return was not just justified, it was revolutionary. And the most visible, the most dramatic, the most communicative act of revolutionary violence? Killing the people at the top. What followed was unlike anything in the modern world had seen. In the span of roughly 20 years, from the early 1880s to 1901, a wave of assassinations struck the most powerful figures on earth. A French president, a Spanish prime minister, an Austrian empress, an Italian king, and then in 1901, the President of the United States, William McKinley, shot at a public exhibition in Buffalo, New York, by a young factory worker named Leon, who had read anarchist pamphlets and decided that one act could speak louder than a lifetime of words. These weren't connected operations. There was no central command. No coordinated organization pulling strings behind the scenes. That was precisely the point. The ideology of propaganda by the deed didn't require coordination, it required inspiration. One person reading about another person's act, deciding to act themselves. A decentralized chain of violence, spreading not through orders but through ideas. In 1881, the International Anarchist Congress in London formally endorsed the tactic. The message was clear. Individual acts of political violence were not crimes. They were communications, demonstrations to the world and to the oppressed masses that no ruler was untouchable, that the state was not omnipotent. The fear could flow both ways. The strategy had a total flaw though. Every assassination generated not revolution, but repression. Governments responded with emergency legislation. International police networks were formed specifically to track anarchists across borders. Extradition treaties were signed. Surveillance expanded. The public, rather than rising up in solidarity, largely recoiled in horror. The propaganda being communicated wasn't the one the anarchists intended. Instead of, the state is fragile, rise up, the message received was, there are bomb throwing lunatics among us, give the state more power. The movement by the early 1900s was in decline. Its most dramatic tactic had become its greatest liability. And yet, the culture of political assassination it had normalized. The idea that a single individual with enough conviction and access to the right weapon could redirect the course of history. That idea did not die. It was about to prove itself, catastrophically, on a Sunday morning in June 1914. Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. A 19-year-old Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip is standing on a street corner, having already given up on his mission for the day after an earlier failed attempt. Then, by a turn of fate that historians still marvel at, the motorcade of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, takes a wrong turn. The car stops to reverse, directly in front of Princip. He fires twice. Princip was not an anarchist in the strict sense. He was a nationalist, part of a movement seeking to free Bosnia from Austro-Hungarian rule. But he had grown up in the same political atmosphere that the anarchist movement had created. He had read the same literature, absorbed the same logic. One act, one movement, one person, change everything. What he could not have fully understood, what perhaps no one in that motorcade, on that street, in that city understood, was what he had just set in motion. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand triggered a diplomatic crisis that, within 6 weeks, pulled every major power in Europe into a conflict that would become the First World War. 37 million casualties, the collapse of 4 empires, the redrawing of the entire map of the world from 2 bullets. This is the lesson of the age of assassins. And it is one that every subsequent generation of political violence had to reckon with. Violence aimed at a symbol rarely produces the outcome its perpetrators intended. The anarchists wanted revolution. They got crackdowns. Princip wanted a free Bosnia. He got a world war that consumed the very empire he was fighting and replaced it with something far more complicated. But here is what did happen. Consistently, across every assassination of this era, the fear spread, the systems hardened, the surveillance grew, the definition of who counted as a threat expanded. In trying to demonstrate that the state was fragile, the propagandists of the deed made the state stronger. It is a pattern we will see again and again. The age of the individual assassin carrying out solitary acts of violence in the name of an idea, that era faded. But the idea itself didn't. It just found new forms, new technologies, new justifications. And in the 20th century, those new forms would operate on a scale that the anarchists of the 1880s could never have imagined. Here is a question that has no easy answer, and I want you to actually sit with it. Not reach for a quick response, but genuinely think about it. If a government is occupying your land, killing your people, stripping your community of rights, housing, and basic dignity, and every peaceful avenue of resistance has been tried and crushed, at what point does violence become justified? And if it is justified, is it still terrorism? This is the question that 20th century could never resolve. And the reason it couldn't is because the answer depends entirely on who you ask. Let's start with Ireland, because Ireland gives us one of the clearest, most documented, most debated examples of this exact tension. The Irish Republican Army, the IRA, was founded in 1990 with a straightforward objective: end British rule in Ireland and establish an independent republic. Britain had governed Ireland for centuries. By the early 20th century, that governance had included famine, suppression, and the systematic marginalization of the Catholic population in the north. Under Michael Collins, the IRA employed guerrilla tactics, ambushes, raids, sabotage, that forced Britain to the negotiation table. A settlement was reached. A partial independence was granted. But the island was partitioned. 6 counties in the north remained under British rule, and for a substantial portion of the Irish nationalist movement, that was not acceptable. What followed was decades of conflicts, bombings, assassinations, punishment beatings, hunger strikes, and a cycle of violence and retaliation that would last, in one form or another, until 1998. Between 1969 and 1994 alone, the IRA killed approximately 1,800 people. Around 600 of them were civilians. To the British government, to the families of those victims, to the international community watching, this was terrorism. Unambiguous, inexcusable. To many Irish Catholics in Northern Ireland, people who had watched unarmed civil rights marchers beaten by police, who had seen 13 protesters shot dead by soldiers on a single Sunday in January 1972. In what became known as Bloody Sunday, the IRA was something else entirely. It was protection, it was resistance, it was the only force that seemed willing to fight back. Both of those things were simultaneously true, and that is what makes the history so difficult to hold. Ireland was not unique, not even close. Across the 20th century, as European empires began to crack and collapse, the same question erupted on almost every continent. In Algeria, a resistance movement waged a brutal campaign against French colonial rule. Bombings in civilian markets, targeted assassinations, guerrilla warfare. France called them terrorists. The Algerian people called them freedom fighters. When Algeria gained independence in 1962, the men France had imprisoned and tortured became the founding fathers of a nation. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising against British colonial rule was met with mass detention camps, systematic torture, and collective punishment of entire villages. People called the Mau Mau terrorists. Decades later, the British government was forced to formally acknowledge and apologize for the atrocities committed against them. In every case, the word terrorism was being deployed, not just to describe violence but to delegitimize an entire movement. To close off the question of whether the governance was just, to say whatever you are fighting for, the method disqualifies you from being heard. And in every case, the people using that word had armies, navies, and governments. The people it was applied to had almost nothing else. The Cold War added an entirely new layer to this already tangled picture. Because now, whether a group was labeled terrorist or freedom fighter didn't just depend on what they did, it depended on which superpower found them useful. The United States and the Soviet Union spent 4 decades funding, arming, training, and protecting violent non state groups around the world. Not because they believed in the group's causes, but because those groups were fighting their ideological battles for them. Proxy warfare. Someone else bleeds, someone else dies. The superpowers get the strategic outcome without a formal declaration of war. The Soviet Union supported revolutionary movements across Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. The United States, on the other hand, backed anti-communist insurgencies and most consecutively funded and armed an Islamic resistance movement in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion of the 1980s. Those fighters were celebrated in Washington, called brave, called freedom fighters. You may already know where that story goes. Here is what the Cold War taught the modern world about terrorism. Violence is not classified by what it does, it is classified by whose side it's on. A bombing carried out by a group you support is a military operation. A bombing carried out by a group opposing you is terrorism. The same act, different label, entirely dependent on political alignment. This is not a cynical observation. It is a documented, historical pattern, one that shaped not just how governments talked about violence, but how they funded it, trained it, and unleashed it. And when the Cold War ended, when the superpowers stopped paying attention, stopped sending weapons, stopped caring about the outcomes, those groups didn't disappear. They adapted. Some of them became the very threats the 21st century is still trying to understand. The 20th century gave us a word, terrorism, and then spent 100 years proving it couldn't define it. Every time a line was drawn, someone pointed to a case that crossed it. Every freedom fighter was someone else's terrorist. Every state that condemned political violence had somewhere in its history committed it. The IRA eventually put down its weapons. Peace was brokered. The man who ordered bombings sat across tables from the man who had imprisoned them, and they found, imperfectly and painfully, a way forward. The story of violence that eventually exhausted itself into negotiation is one ending. But there is another ending, one where the groups don't negotiate, don't exhaust themselves, don't accept the terms on offer. One where the ideology grows more extreme, not less. One where the target stops being governments and starts being animals. September 1972, Munich, West Germany. The Olympics had been called the Cheerful Games. After decades of war, division, and the shadow of what Germany had been, this was meant to be something different. A celebration, a statement to the world that a new Germany had arrived. The organizers had spent less than $2 million on security. Guards were unarmed. The atmosphere was deliberately open, relaxed, welcome. They had been warned. A police psychologist had drafted detailed scenarios of possible attacks, including, with haunting precision, a situation in which Palestinian gunmen would scale the Olympic Village fence at dawn, take Israeli athletes hostage, and demand the release of prisoners. The organizing committee decided that preparing for such threats would ruin the mood. They dismissed the psychologist weeks after the attack he had predicted. Almost to the detail, came true. 4:30 in the morning, September 5th. 8 men scale a fence. They are dressed as athletes. They carry duffel bags. They have stolen keys and detailed maps of the Olympic Village. By sunrise, 11 Israeli athletes and coaches are either dead or being held hostage in their quarters at 31 Connolly Strasse. By midnight, they are all dead. 11 Israelis, 1 German police officer, 5 of the attackers. A 20-hour siege, watched live by an estimated 1 billion people around the world. The number, 1 billion viewers, is the detail that changes everything about how we understand this attack. Because the men who planned it understood something that no previous terrorist group had fully grasped. The Olympics was not just a sporting event. It was the largest simultaneous global broadcast in human history. Every major television network on earth had cameras in Munich. Journalists from dozens of countries were already there, already set up, already live. The terrorists didn't need to spread their message. The infrastructure for spreading it was already assembled and waiting. All they had to do was act. Researchers who study the relationship between terrorism and media have a term for this: media-oriented terrorism. Attacks designed not just to cause harm, but to maximize coverage, to choose targets, locations, and timings that guarantee the cameras will be there. Munich was its defining moment. The Olympic Village, the Israeli team, the most watched event on the planet. Every element was chosen because every element would be broadcasted. For the first time in history, terrorism didn't just frighten the people in the room, it frightened everyone watching at home. And here is the uncomfortable truth that researchers have spent decades documenting. It worked. Not in the way the attackers intended, their specific political demands were not met, but in the deeper strategic sense, the one that matters more. The world now knew their cause existed. Governments that had ignored it were forced to respond. The Palestinian issue, which had been sidelined in international diplomacy, became impossible to ignore. A terrorism scholar once noted that the early logic of the modern terrorist could be summarized simply: terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. Munich was the proof of concept. The aftermath was revealing in its own right. The rescue operation was a catastrophe. Untrained snipers, no radios, no coordination, weapons without night vision. Every Israeli hostage died not during the initial attack, but during a botched rescue attempt at an airbase 15 miles outside the city. 6 weeks later, the 3 surviving attackers who had been arrested were released when their associates hijacked a German airliner and threatened to blow it up. West Germany handed them over within hours. An investigation years later suggested that hijacking had been pre-arranged with German knowledge. That West Germany quietly had simply wanted the whole thing to end. Israel's response was different. Prime Minister Golda Meir authorized a covert assassination campaign targeting every planner and organizer of the Munich attack. Over the following years, operatives haunted them across Europe and the Middle East. The operation made headlines. inspired films, and set a precedent for state-sponsored, targeted killing that governments still debate and practice today. The world had watched the attack. Now it watched the response. And it absorbed both lessons. Munich accelerated something that was already beginning: the globalization of terrorism. Before 1972, most political violence was local. A bomb in Belfast was a Belfast problem. An assassination in Beirut was a Beirut problem. The world noticed, occasionally condemned, and moved on. After Munich, that changed. Because after Munich, every government in the world understood that an attack anywhere could reach everywhere. Instantly. Live broadcast. Into living rooms across every time zone simultaneously. And every group with a grievance watched Munich and learned the same lesson. If you want the world to hear you, don't attack a government building at 3 am. Attack something the cameras are already pointing at. This logic: study what gets covered, design your attack around it, choose your target for its symbolic visibility as much as the strategic value, has been documented by researchers tracking terrorist attacks across the decades since Munich. The data is unambiguous. Terrorist organizations have become progressively more media-oriented over time. The attacks get bigger, more symbolic, more visual, more timed to moments when the world is already watching. The organizers of the 1972 Munich Olympics wanted to show the world a cheerful Germany. What they showed the world instead was something that could never be unseen: that a small group of determined men with a plan and a fence to climb could hold the attention of 1 billion people for 20 hours. That the cameras themselves, the infrastructure of global media built to celebrate human achievement, could be turned into the most powerful weapon a terrorist organization had ever had access to. Free of charge. No technical expertise required. Just a target symbolic enough that the world couldn't look away. The age of local terrorism was over. The age of the global spectacle had begun. And it would not stop here. Every movement we have looked at so far had something to negotiate with. The IRA wanted a united Ireland. You could draw a map around that. The anarchists wanted the end of hierarchical power. Extreme, yes, but a political position. Even the Cold War proxy groups were fighting for ideological control of states and governments. There was always, somewhere, a table you could theoretically sit at. What changes in the late 20th century is the emergence of violence that doesn't want a seat at the table, that believes the table itself is an abomination, that the entire existing world order, its governments, its borders, its secular laws, its cultural values must be reformed, must be replaced. And that God had personally assigned this task to the people with the weapons. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to 1979. Not September, January. Iran. For decades, Iran had been governed by a Shah, a monarch closely aligned with the United States and the West, who had used American backings to modernize the country, accumulate enormous personal wealth, and suppress political opposition through a secret police force that was, by any standard, brutal. The resentment this generated was enormous. Across every class, the poor, the intellectuals, the clergy, the merchants, a broad coalition that agreed on almost nothing except one thing: the Shah had to go. What happened next is one of the most consequential political transformation of the 20th century. Because the revolution that overthrew the Shah was not led by liberals or socialists or nationalists, though all of them participated. It was led by a 76-year-old cleric who had spent 15 years in exile, whose sermons had been smuggled into Iran on cassette tapes, and who had a vision of governance that the world has not seen implemented in the modern era. Ayatollah Khomeini believed that Islamic law, interpreted and administered by Islamic jurists, was the only legitimate form of government. Not democracy, not monarchy, not socialism. Theocracy. And when millions of Iranians poured into the streets in February 1979, when the Shah fled and the old order collapsed, Khomeini's vision was the one that filled the vacuum. The Iranian Revolution sent a message that traveled across the entire Muslim world almost instantly. The message was this: a Western-backed, militarily powerful, apparently unshakable secular government could be brought down, not by a foreign army, not by a nuclear weapon, but by the force of religious conviction and mass mobilization. If it could happen in Iran, it could happen anywhere. For some, this was deeply inspiring. For Western governments, it was deeply alarming. And for a generation of young Muslim men, many of them educated, many of them economically frustrated, many of them watching their governments bend to American pressure and their cultures absorb Western values, it was something more specific. It was proof that the old order was fragile. The other crucial event of 1979 happened in December. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. What followed was a decade-long conflict that would, with devastating irony, plant the seeds of the next era of global terrorism. The United States, seeing an opportunity to bleed the Soviet Union in a proxy war, began funding, arming, and training an Islamic resistance movement in Afghanistan. Young men from across the Muslim world traveled there to fight. They were celebrated in Washington, called brave, called freedom fighters. Among them was a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. He was not, at this point, an enemy of the United States. He was, in a very real sense, an instrument of American foreign policy. What bin Laden saw in Afghanistan was a vision. A stateless, borderless army of believers fighting not for any nation but for Islam itself, defeating a superpower through faith and guerrilla warfare. When the Soviets withdrew in 1989, this vision seemed confirmed. If a superpower could be driven out of a Muslim land by dedicated fighters, why stop there? Bin Laden's analysis of the world was theological, but the conclusions were geopolitical. He believed the Muslim world was under siege by Western military presence, by secular governments that he considered apostate, by American support for Israel, and he believed that the appropriate response was global jihad, not the defensive jihad of protecting a specific territory. Global, offensive, aimed at the foundations of the entire world order he considered corrupt. Al-Qaeda, the organization he founded, was not structured like previous terrorist groups. It had no specific territorial claim, no negotiation position, no single government demanding particular concessions. It operated in cells across dozens of countries, funded by networks that crossed borders invisibly, motivated by an ideology that could radicalize someone in Hamburg as easily as in Kandahar. The attacks came in stages. The US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, the USS Cole in 2000. Each time the response from Washington was insufficient. Law enforcement operations, cruise missiles fired at empty camps, diplomatic protests, and so the planning continued. September 11th, 2001. 19 men, 4 commercial aircraft, 2 towers that had defined a skyline, a Pentagon, a field in Pennsylvania where passengers on a 4 plane decided they would not let the aircraft reach its target. 2,977 people died. It remains the deadliest terrorist attack in recorded history. And unlike Munich, which shocked the world through a television broadcast, 9/11 was watched live by hundreds of millions of people as it happened, on every screen in every country, in real time. The second plane hitting the South Tower, watched live by the world. The buildings falling, watched live. The researchers who study media-oriented terrorism described 9/11 as the highest scoring attack in history on every measurable dimension. Symbolic targets, massive casualties, visual documentation, global reach, timing designed to maximize audience. It wasn't just an attack, it was a broadcast. Here is what made this era different from everything that came before. The Sicarii wanted to expel Rome from Judea. The IRA wanted a united Ireland. Even the anarchists wanted a specific political transformation. All of them had a condition that, if met, ended the violence. Al-Qaeda's state conditions, the withdrawal of the West military presence from the Muslim lands, the end of American support for Israel, the overthrow of every secular Muslim government were not conditions any Western government could or would meet, which meant this was not a conflict with a negotiating table at the end. It was a conflict designed to be permanent. And the response it generated, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, the global surveillance apparatus, the expansion of state power in the name of security, the erosion of civil liberties, the Islamophobia, the 100,000 dead civilians in wars that followed, all that would become, in the years ahead, its own form of radicalization fuel. Violence producing the conditions for more violence. Fear producing the conditions for more fear. The Iranian Revolution proved that religion could topple governments. Al-Qaeda proved that religion, weaponized, globalized, stripped of territorial limits, could strike anywhere, anytime, and force the most powerful nation in human history to reorganize its entire domestic and foreign policy in response. But here is the question that should sit with you. If you design an ideology of violence with no achievable political endpoint, if you build a movement that cannot negotiate, that defines any compromise as betrayal, that celebrates death as victory, what happens when the movement loses? Does it end? Or does it fragment, mutate, find new names, new territories, new causes, and continue? The answer to that question defines the next decade of this story. Tuesday morning, September 11, 2001. It begins like every other Tuesday. People commuting to work, office buildings filling up, a clear, blue, almost impossibly beautiful sky over the New York City. At 8:46 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 11 is deliberately flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Most people who saw it assumed it was an accident. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 hits the South Tower. At that moment, with the second plane visible on live television screens around the world, so one assumed anything anymore. No one assumed anything anymore. By 10:28 that morning, both towers had collapsed. The Pentagon had been struck. A fourth plane had crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers learned what was happening and attempted to retake the aircraft, almost certainly preventing a fourth strike on Washington. 2,977 people were killed. Citizens from more than 80 countries, 343 firefighters, 72 law enforcement officers, thousands more who would develop total illness from the toxic dust in the years that followed, a death toll that continues to grow to this day. It remains the deadliest terrorist attack in recorded history. But here is what makes September 11th different from every other attack in this story. It wasn't just the scale. It wasn't just the death toll. It wasn't even the live broadcast, though that mattered enormously. What made September 11th the fulcrum of modern history was what happened next. Because the response to this attack didn't last days or weeks or even years. It lasted 2 decades. Reshaped governments, rewrote rules, displaced tens of millions of people, changed the daily experience of traveling, crossing borders, and living in a major city. For everyone on Earth, including people who had never heard of Al-Qaeda. Within hours of the attack, the CIA had identified Al-Qaeda as responsible. Within days, President George W. Bush stood between Congress and declared a global war on terror. Within weeks, the United States and its allies had invaded Afghanistan, where the Taliban government had harbored the organization that planned and executed the attack. The initial public response was overwhelming. In the days after 9/11, Bush's approval rating reached 90%, the highest ever recorded for a US president. In a survey conducted just days after the attacks, 77% of Americans said they supported military actions, even if it meant thousands of US casualties. The world briefly was united. More than 80 countries had lost citizens in the towers. NATO invoked Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, for the first and only time in its history, declaring that an attack on one member was an attack on all. The question wasn't whether to respond. The question, the one that would define the next 20 years, was how. Afghanistan was the beginning. The Taliban regime fell within months, but bin Laden escaped, and the war, which had seemed decisive and swift, stretched on and on and on. And then in 2003, on intelligence that would prove to be wrong, and with a stated justification that the 9/11 Commission later found no credible evidence to support, the United States invaded Iraq. 2 wars, 2 countries, thousands of American service members killed, hundreds of thousands of civilians dead. Costs that a study by Brown University's Costs of War project later estimated at over $8 trillion, with more than 4 million deaths when including the indirect casualties of the conflicts they ignited. The man most responsible for the original attack, Osama bin Laden, wasn't found for almost 10 years. He was killed in Pakistan in May 2011 by a US Special Operations raid. The war in Afghanistan continued for another decade after that. But the most permanent transformation wasn't on foreign soil. It was here, at home, in the architecture of daily life. In the weeks and months after 9/11, governments around the world, led by United States, passed sweeping legislation that expanded state surveillance, increased intelligence agency powers, created new security bureaucracies, and fundamentally shifted the balance between civil liberties and security in ways that had no expiration date. The USC Patriot Act, the Department of Homeland Security, mass warrantless surveillance programs that a decade later a former NSA contractor would reveal were collecting the communications of hundreds of millions of ordinary citizens. Airports transformed into security theaters that still define how we travel today. Indefinite detention, enhanced interrogation, a phrase that replaced a shorter, less comfortable word. A Pew Research survey found that in September 2001, 55% of Americans said it was necessary to give up some civil liberties to fight terrorism. For most of the following decade, more Americans said their bigger fear was that the government hadn't gone far enough in protecting them, not that it had gone too far. Fear, once installed, is very hard to remove. Anti-Muslim hate crimes in the United States rose nearly tenfold in 2001. 20 years later, they remained roughly 5 times higher than their pre-9/11 level. The attack of the 19 men, condemned swiftly and clearly by Muslim leaders and organizations around the world, had permanently altered how millions of Muslim Americans experienced their own country. In the 2016 study on historical events, 76% of Americans named 9/11 as one of the 10 most impactful events of their lifetime. The next highest response, at 40%, was the election of Barack Obama. Nothing else came close. September 11th was the day the modern world got its defining wound. Not just because of what happened, but because of what the response revealed about us. About how fear, at sufficient scale, can make a free society vote for its own surveillance. About how grief, weaponized by politics, can justify wars that last longer than most people who fought in them had been alive when they started. About how the line between protecting people and controlling them can blur, and stay blurred, for decades. The war on terror didn't end terrorism. In some ways, the evidence suggests it made the conditions for it worse. Bin Laden had said, in writings found after his death, that one of his strategic goals was to draw the United States into prolonged, costly conflicts in Muslim majority countries, conflicts that would bankrupt America, inflame resentment, fuel recruitment. He was killed before he could see it fully play out. But the world he aimed at building, more fragmented, more fearful, more surveilled, more suspicious, arrived anyway. And in that world, something new was growing. Something that had learned from Al Qaeda's mistakes. That was faster, more decentralized, more media savvy, and more brutal. Something that didn't just want to destroy the world order, it wanted to replace it and film every moment of the process. Here is a question that changes everything about how we understand terrorism in the 21st century. What do you need to radicalize someone? For most of history, the answer involved physical proximity. You needed a charismatic recruiter, a community, a mosque, a prison cell, a neighborhood. You needed human contact. You needed time. The process of turning an ordinary person into someone willing to commit violence was slow, local, and expensive. And then the internet arrived, and suddenly you needed none of that. When Al Qaeda was at its peak, it ran training camps, physical infrastructure. Men had to travel to Afghanistan, to Pakistan, to Yemen, often at great personal risk and cost, to receive training, to meet the network, to be vetted and trusted. The barrier to entry was high. The pipeline was traceable. Intelligence agencies could monitor the flows of people and money. What ISIS understood and what made it fundamentally different from every terrorist organization that came before it was that the internet had made all of that unnecessary. You didn't need a training camp if you could post training videos on YouTube. You didn't need a recruiter if you had Twitter. You didn't need a physical caliphate if you could build a virtual one. And that existed in every country simultaneously. That was open 24 hours. That spoke to potential recruiters in their own language, on their own platform, at whatever hour they happened to be alone and searching for something. ISIS didn't stumble into this. It was a deliberate, sophisticated strategy. At its peak, the organization was producing thousands of pieces of content every month. Videos, infographics, magazines in multiple languages, a news agency, a radio station. It created content specifically calibrated for Western audiences, designed to speak to alienated young people, not in the language of theology, but in the language of identity, adventure, belonging, and purpose. The videos were cinematic, professionally edited. Some drew deliberately on the visual vocabulary of the video games and action films, blurring the line between the real and the fictional until the distinction felt almost irrelevant. The message wasn't primarily religious in the way most people expected. It was existential. It said, your life is empty. The world is corrupt. You were made for something greater than this. Come and be part of something that matters. That message found purchase in places no one expected. Not just in the Middle East, in Belgium, in France, in Minnesota, in Manchester, in the suburbs of London and the outskirts of Sydney. By some estimates, over 30,000 people from more than 100 countries traveled to join ISIS in Iraq and Syria between 2011 and 2016. Social media played a direct role in the radicalization of almost every one of them who came from Western countries. But the foreign fighter pipelines was only part of the story. Because ISIS also understood something that Al Qaeda had not fully grasped. You didn't actually need people to travel. You could radicalize someone, inspire them, give them a target and a method entirely online, and then they could act where they already were. This is what terrorism scholars call the lone wolf, a single individual operating without direct contact with any organization, inspired by an ideology absorbed through screens. No coordination, no change of command, no prior criminal history that would flag them to intelligence services. Often, no warning at all. The attacks that followed this model hit a concert in Manchester, a Christmas market in Berlin, a bridge in London, a truck in Promenade in Nice, a nightclub in Orlando. Each carried out by someone who, days or weeks before, had been a person living an ordinary life, until something shifted. Something they read, something they watched, something that found them in the dark and told them their anger had a purpose. Here is what made this so difficult for governments and intelligence agencies to combat. Organized terrorism leaves traces. Money moves. People meet. Phones communicate. Surveillance at sufficient scale can intercept these signals. The 9/11 attacks involved years of planning, multiple countries, financial transfers, training camps, all of which generated data that, in retrospect, was visible to intelligence agencies that simply failed to connect the dots. Lone wolf radicalization leaves almost no trace. A person alone in a bedroom, watching videos, reading forums, spending hours in encrypted chat groups, until one day they act. No coordination to survey, no conspiracy to infiltrate, no network to map and disrupt. A 2015 congressional hearing on social media and radicalization found that Social media had played a role in the recruitment or radicalization of virtually every American case of ISIS related terrorism in that year alone. At the time of the hearing, there were an estimated 43,000 active pro ISIS accounts on Twitter alone. 90,000 pro ISIS tweets were being posted every day. Platforms designed to connect people were being used with enormous sophistication to connect people to an ideology that celebrated killing them. The response from governments was predictably blunt. More surveillance, more removal of content, more restrictions on encrypted communication, more monitoring of young Muslim men, regardless of whether they showed any signs of radicalization. The response from tech companies was slower, grudging, and ultimately inadequate, at least initially. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all of them faced the same fundamental tension. Their business models depended on engagement. Extreme content generated extreme engagement. The algorithm rewarded outreach, conflict, and intensity. Terrorist propaganda was, by design, maximally engaging. The platforms eventually began removing accounts at scale. ISIS adapted. New accounts appeared within hours. New platforms were found. Telegram, encrypted messaging apps, obscure forums where moderation was minimal or non existent. The whack-a-mole analogy became standard. For every account removed, three more appeared. For every platform that cracked down, another became a haven. But here is the most important thing to understand about what ISIS built online and about what it represents for the future of terrorism. The physical caliphate is gone. ISIS was militarily defeated in Iraq and Syria by 2019. Its territory was recaptured. Its leadership was killed or scattered. The online caliphate never fell. The ideology, the recruitment pipelines, the videos, the manifestos, the networks, they survived the military defeat. They went underground, moved to new platforms, and continued operating. Affiliated groups spread across Africa, South Asia, and Central Asia. Inspired lone wolves continued to act on Western cities. And crucially, other movements were watching and learning. Far-right extremists adopted the same playbook, the same meme culture, the same use of irony and in-group language to recruit young men, the same pipeline from mainstream platforms to increasingly extreme private channels. The algorithm of hate that ISIS perfected was not a Muslim invention or a jihadist invention. It was a human invention, a template, and once it existed, it was available to anyone willing to use it. 19 men with box cutters changed the world by flying planes into buildings. But the transformation ISIS brought wasn't measured in body counts, it was measured in architecture. It built a new infrastructure by producing, distributing, and consuming extremist ideology. One that operates at the speed of the internet, that requires no physical location, that costs almost nothing to maintain, and that is available to anyone with a phone and a grievance. The question of how you fight an enemy that has no address, no army, and no need for either is one that governments, technology companies, researchers, and communities are still trying to answer. And the honest answer, 2 decades into the internet age of terrorism, is we haven't. Here is a number that should stop you. In the United States, since September 11, 2001, the deadliest foreign terrorist attack in history, more Americans have been killed by domestic right-wing extremists than by jihadist terrorism, or slightly more. According to data compiled across multiple research institutions, right-wing extremism has accounted for the majority of domestic terrorist attacks and plots in the United States in the 2 decades since 9/11. The attacks on a synagogue in Pittsburgh, a Walmart in El Paso, a church in Charleston, a supermarket in Buffalo, a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, a youth camp in Norway, all carried out by people who were not foreign, were not part of a global network based on a distant country, were not trained in a camp, were not radicalized by a charismatic imam. They were radicalized by a website, a forum, a manifesto posted on a message board. They were radicalized at home. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how fundamentally the conversation about terrorism has failed to keep pace with the reality. For 2 decades after 9/11, the dominant frame was clear. Terrorism meant foreign. Terrorism meant religious. Terrorism meant Islamic extremism originating abroad. This frame shaped legislation, intelligence budgets, surveillance priorities, and public perception. It was not wrong as a description of the threat in 2001, but the threat changed, and the frame did not. While governments poured resources into monitoring foreign networks, a different kind of radicalization was accelerating. One that looked domestic, spoke the local language, wrapped itself in familiar symbols, and presented itself not as something foreign and alien but as something native and righteous. White supremacy, anti-government extremism, ethno-nationalism, the accelerationist belief borrowed directly from the jihadist playbook. That spectacular violence could destabilize society and trigger a race war or political revolution. The US Department of Homeland Security's own 2020 threat assessment identified white supremacist extremism as the most persistent and lethal terrorism threat facing the United States. FBI Director Christopher Wray confirmed it, placing the threat on par with ISIS itself. The parallels with jihadist terrorism was not coincidental. The ideological infrastructure of modern far-right extremism was built using the same tools, the same platforms, and in many cases the same psychological logic as the online jihadist movements that preceded it. Anonymous forums, encrypted message groups, memes that packed ideology in humor, making it shareable, engaging, and difficult to definitely condemn. Manifestos designed to be read by the next attacker before they act. A culture of copycat violence in which one attack explicitly inspires the next, with perpetrators naming their predecessors in their writings, building a canon of martyrs and heroes. The Christchurch mosque shooter in New Zealand cited the Norwegian mass murderer who killed 77 people in 2011 as an inspiration. At least 6 subsequent attacks explicitly cited Christchurch. The El Paso Walmart shooter called Christchurch the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter, the Poway synagogue shooter, a chain of violence passed from screen to screen, from manifesto to manifesto, from one alienated young man to another. The methodology was identical to what ISIS had pioneered for jihadist terrorism. It was simply wearing different symbols. What makes the modern domestic terrorism landscape particularly difficult to address is something researchers have identified as the central challenge of this era. There is no organization to infiltrate. The most dangerous actors in this space are often what terrorist scholars call lone wolves, individuals who radicalize independently, plan independently, and act independently. No formal membership, no change of command, no financing that can be traced, no communications that intelligence services can interpret. A 2023 Congressional Research Service report identified lone actors and small groups as among the most significant terrorism threats facing the United States, precisely because they act without a clear group affiliation or guidance, making them challenging to identify, investigate, and disrupt. And critically, they often radicalize online entirely quickly in environments that look from the outside like ordinary internet activity. This is not only an American problem. Across Western Europe and Northern America, fatalities from far right and domestic extremist terrorists have surged. Youth radicalization, with minors now accounting for a significant portion of terror-related investigations in Europe, has become a defining feature of the modern landscape. The radicalization timeline that once took years have compressed, in some documented cases, to weeks. Short-form video, algorithm recommendation systems that push increasingly extreme content to users who engage with milder versions of it. Community spaces, gaming platforms, fitness forums, local discussion boards that gradually introduce political ideology alongside other content. When the ideology feels like a natural part of the conversation rather than an external intrusion. This is the algorithm of hate operating on domestic soil, in domestic languages, targeting domestic grievances. The ideological landscape has also diversified in ways that make categorization increasingly difficult. Traditional religious extremism, jihadist terrorism remains a threat, but it now coexists with anti-government militia movements, incel-motivated violence, climate-linked extremism, sovereign citizen ideology, and strains of accelerationism that cut across political categories entirely. Ideologies that simply want to burn existing societies down, without a clear vision of what comes after. This fragmentation is strategically significant. Governments designed to counter one type of threat, a recognizable foreign organization with identifiable leadership and financing, are poorly equipped to simultaneously monitor dozens of decentralized, shifting, overlapping domestic movements operating across hundreds of platforms. And there is deeper complication than most governments find generally comfortable to confront. Unlike foreign terrorism, domestic extremism exists on a spectrum that begins with constitutionally protected speech. Expressing extremist views is not a crime. Belonging to an extremist group is not a crime. The line between protected belief and criminal violence is real, but it is crossed quickly and often invisibly. The FBI itself has acknowledged the difficulty. Radicalization to violence can happen so rapidly that by the time law enforcement has cause to act, the act may already be imminent or over. Here is the landscape as it actually exists in the present moment. Global terrorism deaths remain concentrated in a handful of conflict zones, predominantly in Africa and the Middle East. But in stable, wealthy Western societies, the threat has fundamentally transformed. It is younger, it is faster, it is more decentralized. It crosses political and ideological categories that previous frameworks never had to account for simultaneously. And it is powered by the same technological infrastructure, the same problems, the same algorithms, the same dynamics of online community and belonging that connects every person reading this to every other person on earth. The war on terror, as it was conceived in 2001, was designed to fight an enemy with an address, a country, a training camp, a funding network. The enemy now has none of those things. It has a Wi-Fi connection and a grievance. And the question of how you fight that how you protect open societies from threats that grow inside them. In the spaces open societies are designed to protect is not just a law enforcement question. It is a question about who we are, and the final chapter of the story hasn't been written yet. We have spent this entire journey watching people choose violence. Ancient people who discovered that fear travels faster than armies. Revolutionaries who gave terror its name and made it government policy. Anarchists who believed one bullet could topple a system. Anti colonial fighters who became either freedom fighters or terrorists depending on who was writing the story. Palestinian militants who understood that cameras mattered as much as guns. Jihadists who weaponized religion against the modern world order. Online extremists who radicalized strangers through a phone screen. Across 10 chapters, across 3000 years. And now, one question. Did any of it work? The honest answer, the one that serious researchers have spent decades trying to produce, is more complicated than anyone on the other side of this debate wants it to be. The simple version says no. Studies of terrorist campaigns across the modern era consistently find that groups rarely achieve their largest stated goals. The anarchists of the 1880s and the 1890s killed presidents and prime ministers but did not trigger the revolution they sought. Al-Qaeda forced the United States into two costly wars but did not expel Western influence from Muslim-majority countries. ISIS built a physical caliphate then lost it. The IRA fought for decades and ultimately negotiated a political settlement rather than winning outright unification. The Red Brigades in Italy carried out hundreds of attacks and collapsed without achieving a single structural political goal. If you measure terrorism by whether it achieved its maximum stated objective, the track record is poor. But this is where the analysis gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because the maximum stated objectives are rarely the whole story. And judging terrorism only by whether it achieves its greatest goals may miss most of what it actually does. Consider the IRA. It did not win a united Ireland, but it forced the British government to the negotiating table after decades of refusing to do so. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which ended the conflict, gave Irish nationalists political representation, formal cross-border institutions, and international recognition of their legitimate aspirations that they had been denied for generations. Was this success or failure? Depends entirely on where you are standing. Consider Al-Qaeda. It did not destroy the United States, but it provoked the most powerful military in the history into two prolonged costly wars that killed hundreds of thousands of people, displaced tens of millions, spent trillions of dollars, and left both Afghanistan and Iraq in conditions arguably worse than before the intervention. Bin Laden wrote, before his death, that drawing America into a long war of attrition was a strategic goal. By that measure, the attack succeeded spectacularly. Consider the anarchist assassinations of the early 20th century. They did not end capitalism or monarchy, but the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914 triggered a chain of events that collapsed four empires, killed 37 million people, and permanently reshaped the global order. That wasn't the intended outcome. But the intended outcome and the actual outcome are rarely the same thing in terrorism or in any other form of politics. Researchers who study the question carefully have identified several ways terrorism can be effective that get overlooked when we focus on minimum political goals. Terrorism can shift the political landscape, not by achieving demands directly, but by radicalizing populations, provoking overreaction, and making previously impossible positions mainstream. After 9/11, mass surveillance, indefinite detention, and preventive war, all things that would have been politically unthinkable in August 2001, became law and policy within months. Fear is extraordinarily effective at expanding the acceptable. Terrorism can strengthen organizations internally, even when it fails externally. An attack that produces crackdowns can increase group cohesion, provide a narrative of martyrdom and prosecution, and attract new recruits who feel their people are under threat. Terrorism can kill or suppress ideas, or paradoxically amplify them. The Charlie Hebdo attack in France was intended, presumably to punish blasphemy. Instead, millions of people republished the cartoons. The attack created more distribution of the content it targeted than any editorial decision could have achieved. Repression, in the modern information environment, often functions as the best possible advertising. And perhaps most importantly, terrorism shapes populations. Al Qaeda in Iraq deliberately targeted Shia civilians to provoke sectarian reprisals. The strategy of maximizing civilian suffering to force population displacement and make mixed communities impossible. This isn't failure, it's a deeply cynical form of success, and it worked. It destroyed communities that had coexisted for generations. Some of their damage is permanent. So, what do we do with this? What does it mean that terrorism, a tactic we universally condemn that kills innocent people, that traumatizes entire societies, is not, in the clean analytical sense, simply ineffective? It means that the comforting story, the one that says violence never works, that terrorists always lose, that the right response, simply more force and more time, is incomplete. And incomplete stories make for bad policy. It also means something else, something harder. If terrorism sometimes works partially, conditionally, in ways that are difficult to measure, then the conditions that make it work matter. Poverty and exclusion that make grievances acute, political systems that shut out legitimate dissent, wars that create the very instability terrorist groups exploit, economic arrangements that produce the kind of desperation and humiliation that charismatic ideologues can weaponize. Terrorism does not emerge from nowhere. It emerges from somewhere, from real history, real grievances, real failures of policies and governance, mixed always with ideology, with the particular psychology of individuals willing to choose violence, and with the decisions of movements that could have chosen differently. Understanding that is not apologizing for terrorism, it is the only way to actually reduce it. We began this story with the Sicarii, dagger men moving through crowds in Roman occupied Jerusalem 2000 years ago. The word they used doesn't survive. The grievance that drove them is partially legible to us across the millennia. The empire that opposed is long gone. The community they claimed to fight for still exists. What's the verdict on that? Every generation has produced people willing to use violence to change history. Some of them we call terrorists, some of them we put on monuments. Many of them are both, depending on who won. The lesson of 3000 years is not that terrorism works. It's that the conditions that produce terrorism, exclusion, humiliation, the closing of political space, the failure of systems to deliver basic dignity are extraordinarily durable. They outlast the group that exploit them. They outlast the ideologies that animate them. They outlast the wars that are fought to suppress them. We have spent a long time in this video asking how terrorism changes the world. The better question, the one that has no clean answer, the one that every government and every community and every individual has to keep answering is this: what kind of world produces it? And what would it take to build a different one?